So our next speaker will be a virtual speaker, Dr. Stephen Peitzman, who is a professor of medicine at Drexel University College of Medicine in Philadelphia. And in addition to his day job, I put that in quotes, you can't see that, but that's what I have here, as a nephrologist, which is a significant job. He has a second career as a medical historian and has carried out research and published on a number of subjects, including the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, and it is on this subject that he will speak to us this morning. And I think I'll hand that over to Dr. Peitzman via Zoom. It should.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here at this meeting. And I only learned about it when I contacted Dr. Adams to hear about her teaching of architecture to McGill medical students, because as an architecture enthusiast myself, although not in any way professionally trained, I had in mind, and in fact, last night had one of the sessions of my mini course having to do with the history of the design of hospitals and medical schools. I'm going to begin with a few slides and then just cut them off. There aren't very many, if any, photos of Maude Abbott in her Philadelphia years, 1923 to 25. In fact, Anne Marie Adams once asked me whether photography reached Philadelphia by the 1920s because she was frustrated about not finding any photos. As I checked, and yes, it did. In fact, photography in Philadelphia began in 1839, and one daguerreotype is considered the longest surviving daguerreotype in the United States. But my guess is that Maude Abbott just wouldn't sit still to be photographed very long. So let me see if I can share a screen. So, as many of you will know, Dr. Abbott, so long associated with McGill in Montreal, did spend 2 years in my city of Philadelphia, and that's what I'll be talking about. She was on loan to the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, and because I like buildings, and just to give a little framing here, this is the building she worked in built in 1875, designed by a Quaker architect named Addison Hutton. And by the time she was there in 1923, it was pretty much a weary building and overfilled. And just a few years later, the college moved to much larger quarters that it built in the East Falls section of Philadelphia, which is where I currently live. This is where Maude Abbott lived at least part of her time in Philadelphia. This is the College Club, this building here, and extending behind it, I think maybe this one as well. And this gives a nice indication of what goes on in Philadelphia lately. Many early 19th century and earlier red brick townhouses and glass-clad big things going up. Some of us think too much. I'm going to point out that Maude Abbott's visit in Philadelphia was covered by the newspapers, and this is just one of the smaller representations of that. This one is really kind of interesting, but we'll let it go. Just to show you a little bit about what that building looked like. This is one of the two lecture halls where she would have lectured. Of course, a dissection room here, looking very orderly and probably giving a message for when this photo was used in fundraising pamphlets that women can dissect and remain womanly and everything is clean and scientific. This is a museum, maybe not the way it looked in Maude Abbott's years, somewhat earlier. And that is all. So back to me, and I will get underway. And I originally wrote on Maude Abbott and presented at the American Illustrated Society quite a few years ago, and I'm sure some of my information, although Anne Marie has read it all, some of it probably is subject to reconsideration, and I'll probably know that by the end of this meeting. But anyway, from recollections of those who knew her, one reads that Maude Abbott was a complex, lovable, astonishing, I gather forgetful, and at times infuriating person. She displayed seemingly limitless energy and a nearly manic eagerness to induce more and more projects and obligations. She had a passion for parties, an openness to new friendships, and an ebullience of personality that defied resistance. These all shone well during her 2 years in my city. Though her name stands inseparably associated with McGill, and particularly, of course, its medical museum, in fact, she did separate from McGill for 2 years, spending 1923 to 25 on loan to the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, where she undertook to reorganize its then combined Department of Pathology and Bacteriology, and she did much more. And that's what this paper will describe. And also what her 2 years meant to the pioneering Women's Medical College and what it meant to Dr. Abbott. The school was founded in 1850 by reform-minded Quaker physicians, and it was the first school established anywhere to offer women medical training, the full medical course as early understood, and to award them the MD. And was also the last to survive, becoming Medical College of Pennsylvania in 1969 after a contentious debate following the decision to admit men to the medical school classes. There had always been men on the faculty and later on the house staff. Even after many other schools admitted women, for many years, WMCP still could claim standing as the only medical school in the United States where women could gain senior faculty titles and serve as department chairs and deans. And by the way, Medical College of Pennsylvania was where most of my career was conducted. I'm no longer doing nephrology, but I am still doing teaching and some volunteer general medicine. Women's Med first tendered an offer of professorship in pathology to Dr. Abbott in 1919. And by this time, she was already among the most widely recognized women medical scientists in North America. Excuse me. Loyal to McGill, she declined, though her position at McGill had become somewhat uncomfortable when Horst Ertel, who was not favorable to her or enthusiastic about museums, became acting head of pathology. Women's Med made a more general offer in 1923, and we'll see why a bit later, and Maude Abbott could hardly refuse it. Though she arranged for a leave of absence, she did not resign. And she was formally elected professor of pathology and bacteriology and director of the laboratories by the Women's Medical College Board on 10 July 1923 with a salary of $5,000. She was authorized to hire an assistant, one in bacteriology, one in pathology, and a technician. And appointing this staff, which comprised 3 qualified women, all imported from Canada, amounted to a good part of Abbott's reorganization of her new adopted department. She was the first full-time professor of pathology at WMCP. Her part-time clinician predecessors were pretty capable, but they really weren't fully trained. And she was the first with a really deep and productive background in the field. At McGill, Abbott had, as we all know, had fashioned out of her curatorial labors in museum and library and at the bedside her unique expertise and a measure of renown rarely accorded a medical woman of the early 20th century. And we'll hear more about her work with the museum from my colleague Brenda Zimmerman later in the program, so I won't be talking about that, although she did work on it in Philadelphia at the College Museum. Her eagerness to work and to achieve spread to her staff, whose efforts did not center on the museum. By October of 1923, Dean Martha Tracy wrote with satisfaction that, quote, the enthusiastic members of our new departments of pathology and physiology, there was also a talented woman hired in physiology, desire frequently to work in their laboratories in the evening, carrying out research which must involve experiments needing attention at times when the building is not otherwise in use. And Dean Tracy, by the way, was an MD, a graduate of Women's Med, but also had a PhD, doctorate in physiological chemistry from Penn. Abbott assumed responsibility for directing the college's instruction in pathology and bacteriology. And of course, she carried out much of the pathology teaching herself. And this undoubtedly entailed a huge amount of preparation, since she had never been permitted to lecture in the pathology course at McGill, which kind of indicates the vacuity of her academic title there, lecturer in pathology. In a May 1924 letter to the medical dean at McGill, Abbott described being, quote, completely swamped in the final week of the session, including quizzes, preparation of exams, and so forth. She successfully sought for her students the privilege of attending autopsies at Philadelphia General Hospital, Old Blockley, which once had been carried out by her idol, William Osler. A report by Dean Martha Tracy to alums referred to the autopsy work at the Philadelphia General Hospital under the direction of Dr. Maude Abbott, our professor of pathology and bacteriology. Did Dr. Abbott herself do teaching autopsies at PGH? I don't know. Did she do autopsies at McGill? Dr. Abbott also held the responsibility for reviewing surgical specimens at the college hospital. She stayed busy. And there's more. Abbott also initiated monthly clinical pathological correlation conferences, CPCs, modeled on those created first by Richard Clark Cabot in Boston. Abbott fulfilled expectations of those who hired her to Philadelphia, expectations of an alert upgrading. And she knew that if the CPC was spreading throughout North American medical schools, it had better be established at Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. But let's go beyond pathology. Her propensity for taking on more tasks than anyone could possibly complete and her respect for history and tradition remained evident during her 2 years in Philadelphia as she bonded to her new academic home. It so happened that Abbott joined the Women's Medical College faculty exactly as the school prepared to celebrate its 75th anniversary in 1925. The new chief of pathology promptly joined a committee that was preparing an anniversary volume and she and other activities to celebrate. And she arranged for her recent paper on the clinical classification of congenital cardiac disease to be reprinted in it. And that was very generous, I think. At a 1924 faculty meeting, she requested that some books in the history of medicine be added to the college library, including those by Osler. Her one-year stay was extended to 2 years, but in 1925, Maude Abbott returned as she had planned to McGill and to her invalid sister. But it is clear that she parted on good terms. She later visited the college often and remained in touch with some of its faculty. She recommended her friend Helen Ingleby, a pathologist born and trained in Britain, to succeed her, and the college accepted her recommendation. Women's Medical honored Dr. Abbott by inviting her to read the Hippocratic Oath on the historic occasion of commencement in the 75th anniversary year. And she was typically described as popular with students and faculty alike. Let us look more carefully at what Maude Abbott's 2-year tenure meant to Women's Medical College. To understand this, and why they wanted her so badly, to understand this, one needs to comprehend the fragile status of the school in 1923. The majority of women pursuing medical training in the US at that time sought one of the few places made available by then in most of the previously all-male schools, some of which admittedly had higher prestige. So Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, the sole surviving women's school, struggled to fill even its relatively small classes. In 1921, the college had almost succumbed to one of its periodic financial crises, only to be saved by a patrician member of its board, who became chair of the board, Sarah Logan Wister Starr. Any of you who know Philadelphia know that that's a bunch of old Philadelphia names, although it sounds kind of like a law firm. And in addition, several loyal alums who at one meeting each stood up and pledged a large gift. But then in 1923, Mrs. Starr, who had become the chairman of the board, having sought more firm financial measures, fired a professor of obstetrics named Alice Talent. And she was one of the most admired and nationally known faculty members. And she was fired for alleged lack of cooperation with the new fiscal tightness. Following this decision by the board, well, basically all hell broke loose. Much of the faculty resigned, including longtime faculty members. The students briefly went on strike, and a segment of loyal alums protested vigorously, all to no avail. But somehow new faculty were found. Philadelphia has never been short of aspiring medical teachers, and the college saga continued. But the dismissal of talent and the ruckus which followed, all covered by Philadelphia newspapers in detail, blemished the academic credibility of the college and called into question the capabilities of its leaders. So it's no surprise then that Mrs. Starr and the board invested much hope in Abbott's appointment. "We must have her goodwill in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and with the Rockefellers," wrote astute board secretary Vita Hunt Francis in October of 1923. Despite its poverty, the college paid Dr. Abbott a salary of $5,000 yearly, I believe more than she ever made at McGill, and probably the largest stipend it had ever paid one faculty member. The board wanted her very badly. And when she accepted, press releases were eagerly dispatched to local newspapers, and reporters went out to visit Dr. Abbott, newly arrived, and interview. The North American's article proclaimed, "Women's Medical fills faculty post. Dr. Maude Abbott of McGill University in pathology chair. Noted authority." The Evening Ledger proclaimed, "Women's Medical College names Dr. Abbott, well known as author." The board members probably did have the needs of students genuinely in mind, not just public relations and influence. "Such women as these," wrote Francis, referring to Maude Abbott and another new and very accomplished appointment, "are going to give new ideals to our students in their daily contact with them." Abbott, of course, found some ways to tell Women's Medical College about William Osler. I'm not going to go into that except to say that if nothing else, doing so probably contributed in some small way to the young women's students' passage into the culture of North American medicine. So Maude Abbott's tenure benefited students of the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania in several ways, and her mere presence likely did bolster the prestige of the school during those troubled years of the early 20s. Her newly built department strengthened the college educationally and scientifically, and we've noted that her junior appointments took their primary academic responsibilities very seriously. And several of the Canadian women recruited by Abbott stayed with the college for some years after Dr. Abbott departed. Abbott's personal attributes affected other lasting goods. "It was just after the Great Schism," wrote Helen Ingleby, her friend and successor at Women's Med, "and she set herself to reconcile warring factions and heal the breach. No one could resist that amazing personality for long, and rival camps would forget their differences sitting side by side at her jolly parties." Ingleby probably exaggerated a bit, but only really a spirited outsider can probably do that work. Reciprocally, what was the meaning of 2 years at Women's Med to Maude Abbott? In a 1924 letter, she wrote, "I enjoy very much the interest of the close touch with the students and the responsibilities of being in charge of a major subject, both of which are more or less new to me. Indeed, at Women's Medical, Abbott was for the first time in charge of something of a department and had much more opportunity to interact with students than at McGill. And whereas at McGill, she was curator of the museum, the title she proudly used in her correspondence and lecturer in pathology, she came to Women's Med as a full professor. True, Women's Med was a small pond, no McGill University, but it could claim, and I think rightly, a unique and meritorious history and a faculty, women and men, with first-rate abilities. And it increasingly justified its continued existence as a rare source of senior faculty and management positions for medical women. One biographer has written that Abbott was not an assertive feminist, but her insistent quest for her own medical education was a feminist action, and she expressed a lifelong sensibility as a woman within medicine. She helped found the Federation of Medical Women of Canada. As early as 1911, she contributed an article on women in medicine to the McGill University magazine. And we know she wrote about the history of nursing. Between 1911 and 1914, she was avidly gathering correspondence in preparation for a comprehensive bibliography of women medical scientists. Seems to have been one of the few projects she never completed. Late in life, she, quote, "was a hit with the students and those who heard you in the meeting of the Women's Medical Society of the University of Pennsylvania while she was in Philadelphia, visiting a sister school. She enjoyed a lecture tour of the United States Pacific Coast, sponsored by the Women Physicians Club of San Francisco, and met lots and lots of women doctors and men as well. I would argue then that Dr. Abbott's sojourn at Women's Med must have held particular meaning to her as a pioneering medical woman, meaning that inseparably added to the obvious expansion of opportunity she found there. We might recall in this regard her eagerness to join longtime Women's Medical College faculty and alums in celebrating the school's 75th anniversary. With various trials along those years, it was remarkable that the school went that far and continued years later for many more years. It's plausible that her 2 years at WMCP fostered, or at least enhanced, an enriching sense of herself as woman and physician scientist, indeed, as part of a proud and lengthening lineage. And the opportunities to manage, teach, and influence stand in sharp contrast to what she confronted, unfortunately, on her return to McGill: an equivocal promotion, but continued erosion of opportunity and standing. The leaders of Women's Medical College in 1923 needed, along with specific expertise in pathology, credibility, and favorable publicity for the school. Its reputation had been bruised by the talent firing about the same time that its founding mission increasingly came to seem, at least to many, obsolete. A distinguished and distinguishing addition to the faculty was needed, and certain criteria had to be met. Of course, the newcomer must be a woman, and she ought to be an outsider, attracted from afar, a visiting star. And that indeed fit Dr. Abbott, who came from Montreal, Canada, adding at least a modest degree of the exotic. Perhaps most critically, the transforming figure's credentials had to fit. In 1923, somewhere within the realm of science, and then as then understood, that was the main criterion. Based on the gross specimen and the medical museum, Maude Abbott's work stylistically would soon begin to look somewhat dated, but she was an author and an authority, published, recognized internationally. I'm learning more and more about her connections from Dr. Adams' work, as we just heard. Women's Medical has lagged behind in such contributions, that is science, research, and its leaders knew that that had to be fixed. Dr. Abbott displayed exactly the suitable gender sensibility and posture for the pioneering, but always socially conservative Women's Med. She self-identified as a woman in medicine, but she was not the vocal political feminist who might provoke discomfort among the more tame-spirited at the college. And to conclude, if we dare suggest that Abbott's gregariousness and her eagerness to foster cooperation represented something like traditional female values, not necessarily inborn, but perhaps in her case induced by her Victorian upbringing, we could arrive at a concluding equation. Her competence and her reputation within the almost entirely male world of medical scholarship did aid in rebuilding the credibility of the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, as seen from the outside, while her maybe feminine ways of dealing with those around her helped reestablish its internal humanity following a most bitter period of strife. Women's Med would continue for many decades, in good times and bad, sustaining its founding mission, even beyond the decision to admit men to its classes in 1969. Thank you very much.